On the fields of Central Europe some 1,000 years ago, a young Swabian nobleman named Radbot was out hunting. He did that often, for the lands of Aargau were beautiful and rich with game. Yet a calamity struck. Radbot had lost his favourite hawk. The young falconer looked for his pet all over his domain. During the search, Radbot reached the river Arre, where he stumbled upon a rocky outcrop. This was a perfect site for a stronghold. Radbot ordered to build a castle there and named it after the hawk, Habsburg. The contracted name of this castle, Habsburg, soon became famous as Radbot's heirs rose to become one of history's most prominent dynasties. The domain of the Habsburgs was truly global. This dynasty presided over a mighty empire that ruled over myriad nations of Europe and huge swathes of the New World, the first one on which the sun never set. In this video, we will trace the origins of the Habsburgs and explore their rise into prominence. And we've also got a special offer for accessing another global empire, the empire of many servers that is our sponsor, NordVPN. And by traveling the web via their servers, not only can you access the whole world's internet content no matter where you are, but you can do it with the improved safety NordVPN offers. Yes, Nord's threat protection system has been continually improving, now giving you massive boosts to both safety and usability online with only a single click. Their Threat Protection Pro features block malware, phishing links, advertisements, web trackers, and fake online stores. That's whether you're using a VPN connection or not, giving you an all-in-one solution that's constantly updated and has 24/7 support for you if you run into trouble. Combined with NordVPN not tracking your activity and actively preventing anyone else doing so via their encryption, you'll be well equipped for facing the threats lurking online, especially on public networks where things can be particularly risky. One subscription covers 10 devices, leaving no holes in your digital armor. Try it out today with 4 months of extra coverage added for free to a 2-year plan when you sign up at nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. They offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a go. That's nordvpn.com/kingsandgenerals. To find the earliest Habsburgs, we must begin our search in 10th century Swabia, which was at the time a duchy of the Holy Roman Empire. Swabia was further divided into self-governing counties, or Gauss. One of these Gauss, located along the river Arre, was called Aargau, and known for having one of the densest concentrations of castles in medieval Europe. It is also where we find the first Habsburg who historians can confirm existed, a nobleman named Lanzelin. The story of Radbot and his hawk is most likely a myth. There was indeed a Radbot who was the son of Lanzelin, but there is no evidence he founded Castle Habsburg or that it was named after his hawk. In addition, Castle Habsburg itself was largely irrelevant. The dynasty we talk about today had a long list of titles and possessions, and Habsburg was listed somewhere on the end of this list. What everyone knew as the House of Austria only picked up the name Habsburg in the 18th century, when tracing one's origins became fashionable. Nowadays, Aargau is a part of Switzerland. Despite this, Swiss historians do not treat the Habsburgs kindly. According to the Swiss narratives, the Habsburgs were evil robber barons. They exploited the local peasants and even forced them to pay 3 shillings for the wife's first night. This, however, was not a fair assessment. Nationalist myths need villains, and the Swiss used the Habsburgs for the role. 3 shillings were a simple payment upon marriage, and it was common for Swiss lands elsewhere. Indeed, the ancestors of the Habsburgs did not need to shake down peasants, for they had a different source of income. Italian merchants heading for the fairs in Champagne or Flanders usually crossed Aargau. Realizing that their land sat on a major trade route, the Habsburgs installed dozens of toll stations to extract income from travelers. With that wealth, they attracted and employed local landowners. In addition, the Habsburgs also accumulated wealth by using their signature move, dynastic inheritance. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, they intermarried with most families in Swabia. Once those families died out, the Habsburgs obtained their lands. It was through this method of intermarriage that the Habsburgs inherited the estates of the houses Pfullendorf and Homburg. Later, they absorbed the Lenzburg inheritance, which came with the title of Count, and they inherited the lands of the larger houses of Züringen and Kieburg. After these acquisitions, Habsburg lands stretched from Strasbourg to Lake Constance, and from the Aare River to the Alps. They had become the second most important house in Swabia. The first was the Imperial family, the House of Hohenstaufen, of which the Habsburgs were loyal vassals. The Hohenstaufens rewarded the Habsburgs' loyalty with patronage and more lands. Emperor Frederick II even became godfather to the newborn Habsburg Prince Rudolf. This arrangement, however, did not last for long. In the mid-13th century, Hohenstaufen rule over Germany collapsed, and the empire entered its great interregnum. There was no government, and the throne was claimed by two foreigners, Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso X of Castile. In the meantime, the lands of the Hohenstaufens were left unguarded. Nearby German lords invaded them, plundering, sacking, and otherwise seizing them. Soon, pillage gave way to quarrels over the spoils. This was a rough time for Germany. To quote a contemporary chronicler, "The days of evil approach, and the evil is growing." After Richard of Cornwall died, the empire received a chance to return to normalcy. The imperial election was coming, and the Pope advocated for the vote to be unanimous. The new emperor was supposed to be powerful enough to bring the house back in order, yet nobody knew exactly who that emperor would be. The most obvious choice was King Ottokar of Bohemia. After all, he was, well, a king. Ottokar was the empire's most powerful lord, and arguably the best man for the job. However, the imperial nobility considered him too strong, and was reluctant to give him even more power. Worst of all, he was a Czech. The lords in Saxony and Brandenburg were powerful too, but they lacked interest in the imperial office. Their lands were remote and busy enough with frontier politics. The prominent house of Wittelsbach was in disorder, for the Duke of Bavaria and Count Palatine were brothers and hated each other. For the choice to be unanimous, the candidate had to be a compromise one. It is here where Rudolf of Habsburg entered the scene. He was a lord in Swabia, the land synonymous with imperial politics. He was not too powerful, although he was rich. He was in his mid-50s, and thus not a threat long-term. He was the godson of the late Emperor Frederick II. Most notably, Rudolf had taken an active part in pillaging the Hohenstaufen estates, and thus would not demand other robber lords to return the spoils. On September 29, 1273, Rudolf was elected King of the Romans. He was the first Habsburg to take control of the Holy Roman Empire, and he would certainly not be the last. The reign of Rudolf I was rather successful. He allied himself with larger lords of the empire, as well as with free cities. With their support, he stopped feuds, abolished illegal tolls, and fought robber barons. He also defied expectations. Rudolf spent much of his efforts to recover the lands of the Hohenstaufens to the imperial crown, that is, to himself. That being said, this policy was selective. Rudolf didn't want to antagonize Bavaria and the Palatinate, so the Wittelsbachs largely got away with their conquests. His main opposition came from Ottokar of Bohemia, the empire's most powerful lord. At this point in the story, we should take a small step back and show who exactly the first Habsburg emperor was dealing with. In 1246, Austria was left without a lord after House Babenberg went extinct. The local nobility invited Ottokar, a teenage prince of Bohemia, to rule the region. Ottokar gladly accepted. To cement his rule, he married the sister of the last Babenberg Duke, Margaret, a woman 30 years older than him. Soon, Ottokar expanded his domain. A war against Hungary brought him Styria before he also inherited Carinthia and Carniola, although under a dubious claim. After becoming the King of Bohemia, Ottokar was in control of the entire eastern flank of the empire. He was also, strictly speaking, a usurper. This was because Austria was an imperial fief and was supposed to revert to the crown after the Babenbergs went extinct. With Austria in their sight, the Habsburgs set things in motion. Rudolf arranged no fewer than 5 dynastic marriages to secure enough support within the empire, and summoned a diet to condemn Ottokar. The King of Bohemia was named an outlaw and excommunicated by the Archbishop of Mainz. A prophecy appeared, claiming that Bohemia was set for a defeat. This is how the Habsburgs waged their wars, with weddings, proclamations, and rumors. In 1272, Rudolf finally struck. His army made its way into Austria and captured Vienna. Facing rebellions at home, Ottokar cut his losses and capitulated. Austria was lost. The King of Bohemia returned home, consolidated support, regrouped, and got ready for round 2. In 1278, the war resumed. Ottokar started his campaign poorly. He took control of strategically unimportant places and wasted time on sieges. Rudolf used this delay to leave Vienna and unite forces with his ally, Ladislaus IV of Hungary. In August, the two sides met on the right bank of the river Morava, or March. The terrain was ideal for cavalry, and indeed both armies consisted mostly of horsemen. There, on the field between Jedenspeigen and Dürnkruth, they would fight a battle which would decide the fate of Central Europe. Ottokar divided his army into 3 contingents, about 2,000 strong each. His vanguard was mostly Czech and consisted of knights from Bohemia and Moravia. The second contingent was the heaviest, composed of German cavalry. In the third group, Ottokar placed his Polish and Silesian allies. Together, he had about 1,000 heavily armed knights and 5,000 light cavalry. Rudolf's army was also divided into 3 groups, each one slightly larger than their Bohemian counterparts. The King of Hungary was given the honor of leading the vanguard. A greater part of his army were Cuman mounted archers, light but highly mobile. The second contingent was made up of knights from Austria. The third and most combat-capable group was composed of Swabians, Alsatians and Bavarians. Rudolf's army was larger, yet he had 3 times less heavy cavalry than Ottokar. The battle was started by the 2 vanguards. The Czechs rode to the south of Jedenspeigen, only to be met by a rain of arrows. The Cuman archers repeatedly approached the Czechs, shot and withdrew, without engaging in close combat. Once the Czech lines were weak enough, Hungarian cavalry struck. Ladislaus IV could be proud of his men. The Czechs fled, and the Habsburgs won the first round. It was time for Ottokar to bring his second contingent. He personally led a force of heavy German knights, his strongest troops, to the Marchfeld. Rudolf responded by sending his Austrian knights to help out the Hungarians. The 2 forces clashed. It soon became clear that the fight was uneven. Ottokar had the upper hand and pushed the Austrians and Hungarians almost to the Weidenbach stream. Rudolf turned to his third contingent, which he led personally. Upon crossing the Weidenbach, he was struck by an enemy and fell off his horse. It looked as if the counterattack was over before it started. Yet Rudolf remounted and resumed the charge. All 3 kings were now engaged in battle. Once the countercharge commenced, a small force of about 200 knights attacked Ottokar from an ambush on the side of the battlefield. Facing a flank attack, a large portion of Ottokar's forces panicked and fled. They took with them the Poles and Silesians, who had barely entered the battle by that point. Ottokar himself remained on the battlefield and was slain. With the death of the Czech king, Rudolf had carried the day. The Bohemian army fled and suffered even more casualties during their rout. Ottokar's body was taken to Vienna and shown publicly for 6 months. His son Wenceslaus made peace with Rudolf and even married his daughter. The war was over. In the wake of their victory, the Habsburgs emerged as the House of Austria, a name they would carry until World War I. Yet not everything went in their favour. Due to the opposition from Württemberg, Rudolf failed to become the Duke of Swabia. His centralization efforts backfired. Protests started in Hamburg. In the Alpine valleys, a certain alliance started to emerge. Most importantly, he failed to secure the imperial throne for his son Albert. After the death of Rudolf I, the electors agreed not to choose a Habsburg again. Duke Albert of Habsburg was technically on board with the idea. The election was won by Conrad of Teck, an obscure Swabian lord in Habsburg's service. Unfortunately for the noble and honourable House of Teck, Conrad was murdered within 48 hours of the election. The new vote was carried by Adolf of Nassau, an opponent of the Habsburgs. He had no significant lands of his own, and was chosen for this precise reason. He was not a threat, until he was. Upon becoming King of the Romans, Adolf made every effort to grab any piece of land he could. After running out of his vassals' patience, the Lord of Nassau was overthrown. Albert of Habsburg, who was the one to fight and kill Adolf, was elected emperor instead. Once in office, Albert tried to do what his father did not, travel to Rome and actually get crowned as emperor. Yet Pope Boniface VIII refused the request, proving that the fear of making the Habsburgs too powerful was still prevalent. In fairness to the Pope, that fear was not unfounded. Albert arranged a dynastic marriage with King Philip IV, allying the Habsburgs to the powerful Kingdom of France. The lords of the empire were now afraid that Albert would use this French support to make the empire a hereditary Habsburg realm. In addition, Albert I still had room to expand his territories. The Kingdom of Bohemia had run out of its Przemyslit rulers and was now up for grabs. Its throne was now occupied by Henry of Carinthia, who claimed to be the rightful heir. Albert disagreed, invaded Bohemia, and installed his son Rudolf on the throne. Yet Henry was not out of the game just yet. he made a common cause with the Saxon House of Wettin, who had their own feud with the Emperor-elect over Thuringia. In May 1307, the joint army fought Albert in the Battle of Lucca and won the day. Bohemia evaded Habsburg rule for now. For Albert, things went from bad to worse. He had a feud with his own nephew John, who wanted a bigger share of the Habsburg domain. In one of the most ill-thought decisions ever made by a Habsburg, John ambushed Albert I on a road and murdered him. Without achieving any of his goals, John now had to hide from vigilantes in Italy, where he died 5 years later. After Albert's death, the electors once again decided to choose some irrelevant lightweight for the throne. This time they picked Henry of Luxembourg. Once on the throne, the new monarch set on a familiar pattern and tried to enlarge his personal domain. Once again, Bohemia was in the spotlight. There, Henry of Luxembourg fought Henry of Carinthia. After the war between Henry and Henry concluded, Bohemia found itself in the hands of the Luxembourgs. To entrench himself in power, Henry of Luxembourg travelled to Rome for coronation. He succeeded, and for the first time in almost a century, the Holy Roman Empire had a crowned emperor. Unfortunately, Henry contracted malaria on the way back and left the empire once again emperorless. The next election was dominated by Team Austria and Team Bavaria. The former was represented by the two sons of Albert I, the Imperial candidate Frederick the Handsome and his more capable brother Leopold. Team Bavaria consisted of the Duke of Bavaria, Louis of Wittelsbach. The two teams drew. That is to say, the electors split, met on opposite sides of the Main River, and chose different candidates. Louis of Bavaria was crowned in Aachen, as is tradition, but without the traditional crown. Frederick of Habsburg got the crown, but was coronated in Bonn instead of Aachen. The Holy Roman Empire was now in a state of civil war. Yet Frederick and Louis were uneager to attack each other directly. The Habsburgs were busy with another problem in Swabia. In its mountain valleys, an armed band from Schwyz had plundered a Habsburg monastery, Einsiedeln. Even worse, the Eternal League was now allied to Louis. Leopold of Habsburg decided to punish the Switzers and marched up the Alps to crush the League. Leopold had 2,000 to 3,000 knights at his disposal. This was a large army for the time, as Leopold expected a tough fight. For this reason, he refused to split his forces and brought all of it into a single valley. The Confederate forces of Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden comprised about 3,000 to 4,000 men. Those were infantrymen armed with halberds, crossbows, knowledge of the terrain, and sheer audacity. They also achieved the element of surprise. Leopold expected an ambush of some sort, but further up the valley. The Confederates had set one up in Zug, which was Habsburg territory. To reach Schwyz, the Habsburg army took the road to the east of Lake Egeria. The pass was narrow, and Leopold's army had to stretch into a long column. At Schafstetten, the road was blocked by a barricade. There, the knights were attacked by Confederate skirmishers. Unable to drive them away, some knights dismounted, climbed up the slope, and tried to engage the Confederates in close combat. Meanwhile, more Habsburg soldiers moved up the valley, unaware of the roadblock. The mountain pass became more and more congested each minute. Then the Switzers struck. Stones and logs rolled down the slopes of the Morgarten ridge. They were followed by masses of fighters armed with rocks and halberds. Armed knights had a hard time controlling their horses. A brutal clash ensued. Halberds cut and thrust, making a quick job of the knights' armor. Many cavalrymen caught in the mountain pass were slaughtered, with some pushed into the lake and drowning. Habsburg forces down the valley could do little to help their comrades and fled the battlefield. Leopold of Habsburg barely escaped the battle alive. In the words of the chronicler, he seemed to be half dead from extreme sorrow. While immensely relevant for Swiss independence, the Battle of Morgarten had little impact on the war. The Habsburgs bit the bullet, recovered, and continued to fight. After all, Frederick of Austria and Louis of Bavaria still had a throne to contest. So it was that the war continued. For years, both sides were engaged in raids and skirmishes, with no decisive battle in sight. Only in September 1322 did the Habsburgs plan a decisive campaign to end the war. Frederick the Fair moved his army from Austria to Passau and then to Mühldorf. There he was met by his ally, the Bishop of Salzburg. In addition, another Habsburg army under Leopold was marching there from Swabia. Louis of Bavaria arrived at Mühldorf roughly at the same time as Frederick and before Leopold. He had fewer forces than the two Habsburgs combined. yet he now had a chance to defeat them in detail. Frederick agreed to give battle. According to the chroniclers, he lamented all the widows and orphans the war had produced and just wanted to end the conflict as soon as possible. The Austrians and Bavarians would clash their spears at Mühldorf. Much like Marchfeld, Mühldorf was a battle fought by cavalry. It was one of the last big knightly battles fought on German soil, and the last one which didn't see the use of firearms. Frederick commanded a force of about 1,400 horsemen, which he divided into 4 units. He also had about 500 Hungarian mounted archers. Louis of Bavaria was assisted by the King of Bohemia, John of Luxembourg. Together, they had a force of about 1,800 horsemen. This was an even fight. Frederick placed the bulk of his army at Mühldorf, between the rivers Inn and Isen. The Hungarians were sent to the other side of the Isen. Their task was to harass the Bavarians during the river crossing. Yet the maneuver failed. Louis drove the Hungarians away, crossed the Isen successfully, and now enjoyed superiority in numbers. The battle continued. Frederick the Fair, decorated with the royal insignia, led the Austrians on a frontal attack against the Bavarians. Although outnumbered, he gained ground and pushed Louis towards Amphi. At the crucial point of the battle, the Burgrave of Nuremberg struck the Austrians from the north. It is unclear whether this was an ambush or if he arrived at the battlefield late, yet the result was the same. The Austrians assumed that those forces belonged to Leopold and were friendly. Yet when the fight broke out, confusion turned into panic. Louis of Bavaria carried the day. Many Austrian knights, including Frederick the Handsome, were turned prisoner, forcing Leopold to retreat back to Swabia. Now in captivity, Frederick agreed to make peace with Louis. The Duke of Bavaria then released him and let him convince Leopold to lay down arms too. Leopold refused. After failing to secure lasting peace, Frederick did the unthinkable. He returned to his captivity voluntarily. Leopold conceded the next year anyway, and Bavaria made peace with Austria. After this, the two dukes agreed to rule the empire together. In this arrangement, the Habsburgs retained their lands, Frederick became the emperor's regent in Bavaria, and even held the honorary title of king. While the war could have gone much worse for the Habsburgs, it was still a defeat, one in which they repeatedly lost battles to the Saxons, Swiss and Bavarians. All the momentum behind their rise was gone. In just 2 generations, they were relegated from German emperors to secondary lords. Even arranging dynastic marriages became difficult. Gone were the times when House Habsburg could marry into the royal houses of Europe. Now, Austrian princesses had to be content with marrying obscure Polish dukes and French nobles. Louis of Bavaria, now Emperor Louis IV, had an eventful reign. He involved himself in Italy, took part in the Western Schism, and even took part in another civil war. The Habsburgs took part in those events, but now they could only play a secondary role. Team Austria gave way to Team Bohemia. Eventually, Louis IV was overthrown, and the imperial throne passed to the Luxembourgs. Charles IV was one of the empire's most famous emperors. While his deeds, doings, and misdemeanors are a topic for another video, one of his achievements deserves a mention in this video. In 1356, he issued a Golden Bull, a document crucial for the history of the empire. It elevated 7 electors, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These electors received the exclusive right to elect emperors, and their lands were declared indivisible. Missing from the list were Bohemia's 2 main rivals, Austria and Bavaria. The Habsburgs were outplayed, outmaneuvered, and left on the sidelines of German history. It looked as if their story had ended. However, nothing could be further from the truth. The Habsburgs rebounded, reformed, and reinvented themselves. The House of Austria rose once again to greatness, and now it was there to stay. This, however, is a story for another day. More videos on Central European history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.